Sometimes a guy has to face the whole world by himself, dealing with heavy stuff no one should have to handle. Jacob Bear McKenna had spent 40 years up in the mountains, where being alone was his only buddy and staying alive was his everyday wish. Now he was sitting in chains in Cedar Ridge's thrown-together courtroom, looking at town folks who wanted payback after his scrap with the bad Dalton gang. The saloon was full of people who'd already decided he was guilty. Judge Morrison lifted his gavel, set to give what everyone thought would be a hanging verdict. Then the door flew open. A lady in a fancy silk dress stepped in like she owned the place, her voice calm and strong. "Your Honor, you can't sentence my husband without listening to his wife." The courtroom went quiet. No one knew who this fancy stranger was or why she'd say such a wild mountain guy was hers. But who was she for real? And what secret linked her to Bear McKenna? Before we go back to the story, tell us where you're listening from. And if this tale gets to you, be sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've got something super special saved for you. The heavy feel of those iron chains had gotten normal-toe Jacob McKenna over the last 3 days. But they felt extra heavy now under the stares of Cedar Ridge's whole bunch of people. Every person in town seemed stuffed into Murphy's saloon, turned into a quick courthouse since there was no real law building. The air smelled like wood dust, booze, and dirty bodies, blending with the stress that snapped like lightning before rain. Bear had known this day would hit someday. A guy couldn't live 40 years in the Colorado area, getting by on his smarts and his gun without making foes. He'd always thought he'd die alone in those mountains, maybe killed by a big bear or taken by the freezing winter. He'd never pictured it ending like this, tied to a chair while town folks he hardly knew picked if he'd see another sunset. The mountains had been his safe spot since he'd come back from the war 20 years ago. Up there, among the tops that touched the sky's bottom, a guy could find calm if he searched enough. Bear had made his cabin with his own 2 hands, picking a place where the morning sun made the valley yellow and the evening glow turned the snowy tops purple. He'd learned to spot weather in the clouds, to follow animals by the tiniest clue, to last months alone, with nothing but his ideas for company. Those ideas had been gloomy buddies at first. The war had left marks deeper than the knife cut across his chest or the bullet that broke his left shoulder. He'd seen nice guys die for reasons they didn't get, had held kids not much past being young as they lost blood in muddy spots far from home. When the battles stopped, Bear couldn't stand going back to normal life, to acting like things could be okay after such bad stuff. So he'd gone up into the tall land where the only noises were wind in the trees and the farcry of eagles. He taught himself to catch animals and hunt, to save meat and fix skins, to find healing plants his Cherokee grandma had taught him as a kid. Slowly, year after year, the mountain quiet had started to fix something in him that army doctors never could have touched. He'd made a good life as a guide and trapper, taking rich guys from the east on hunts who wanted to get a big elk or bear. They'd pay a lot for his help, though most looked at him like he was some weird animal himself. This big, wide-shouldered guy with hair turned gray too soon and eyes that held too many stories. He talked little on those trips, just enough to keep his clients safe and winning. They seemed to like it that way, sharing tales around the fire while he sat away, hearing the night noises and thinking his own stuff. The being alone fit him. He'd gotten comfy with being by himself, even guarding it. When winter shut the high paths, he might go 4 months without seeing another person. Those were the times he liked best, when the world got small to just him and his cabin and the huge white quiet of the mountains. But even guys who live alone in mountains had to go to town sometimes for stuff. Coffee, bullets, salt, the few store-bought things he couldn't make or skip. That's how he'd first met the Dalton gang. 3 brothers and their random buddies who'd been scaring the area for most of 2 years. Cedar Ridge itself was a usual edge-of-the-world town born from hope and need in equal parts. Finding silver in the close hills had pulled miners, sellers, bar owners, and all the other people who chased mining booms like birds chased dead stuff. Main Street went for 6 blocks lined with fast-built wood buildings that had a main store, 2 bars, a hotel, a haircut place that also did doctor stuff, and a few other spots needed for edge life. The people were a mix of hopeful families wanting fresh starts, single guys chasing money, and the usual bunch of wanderers, betters, and chance takers that edge towns pulled. Most were okay people, working hard to make something lasting from wild land. They deserved better than having their days messed up by bad guys who took what they wanted and killed anyone who said no. Judge Morrison was one of the good guys. Harrison Morrison had come west from Illinois with a law paper and real want to bring normal ways to the edge. He was a small, tidy man in his 50s, with wire glasses and a neat mustache that gave him a look of respect, even in these rough spots. Bear had met him a few times over the years, and found him to be fair and not buyable qualities that made him useful in a spot where law often was who had the quickest gun. The judge's wife, Martha, had died of lung sickness their second winter in Cedar Ridge, leaving him alone with his books and his rules. He'd thrown himself into his job, riding between towns, trying to set up some kind of law order in a land where power too often decided right. He treated everyone who came before him with the same careful look, whether they were big sellers or usual wanderers. Sheriff Tom Bradley was different. A thick guy with mean eyes and hands that went too fast for his gun. Bradley had been paid off by different groups since the day he'd put on the badge. He managed to look away when the Dalton gang came through town, always finding important stuff elsewhere when good folks needed help. Bear thought Bradley got a share of what the gang took, but showing it was hard. The Dalton brothers, Eli, Samuel, and young Jesse, had started small, taking from lone travelers and far homes, but wins made them braver and meaner. They'd moved up to stopping supply carts and scaring real businesses for safety cash. Word was they wanted to control all the bad stuff in the area, and they didn't care who got hurt in the way. Bear had stayed away from them mostly, staying in the highland where they didn't go much. Buddha Guy couldn't stay fully away from the world, and soon their paths crossed. Now as he sat in those heavy chains, hearing the low talk of voices around him, Bear thought about how fast a life could change. 3 days ago he'd been looking at his trap spots, liking the cool morning air and the view of new snow on the far tops. Today, he was facing a rope and all because he'd tried to do the right thing. The woman who'd burst through those doors was unlike anyone he'd ever seen in Cedar Ridge. Even in his bad spot, Bear couldn't help but see how nice her clothes were. That silk dress probably cost more than most town folks made in a year. Her dark hair was fixed in a fancy way that showed pro-help, and those pearls around her neck grabbed the lamplight like trapped stars. But it was her way of acting that really set her apart. She moved with the sureness of someone used to folks listening, her voice having the fancy sounds of East School. Everything about her said money, nice ways, and high spot, exactly the opposite of everything Bear was. Yet here she was, saying she was his wife. Bear looked at her face, trying to find some memory that would make sense of her being there. She was pretty in a way that would be hard to forget. High face bones, big dark eyes, a mouth that showed smarts and strong will. But he was sure he'd never seen her before in his life. The courtroom had gone into shocked quiet after her words. Even Judge Morrison seemed lost for what to say. His gavel stopped halfway to the table. Sheriff Bradley's face had garnered with mix-up and mad. While the town folks whispered like leaves in the wind, the woman, this mystery stranger who said she was Victoria McKenna, stood super still in the middle of the room, her chin up and her hands folded calm in front. She showed no nervousness or doubt, as if saying she was married to a mountain guy facing kill charges was the most normal thing ever. Bear found himself weirdly touched by her stepping in, even as it confused him. No one had stuck up for him before, not since his army days, when soldiers watched out for each other to stay alive. He'd gotten used to handling his own fights, to counting only on himself in a world that had shown him little nice. But here was this fancy stranger, risking her own good name and maybe her safety to help a guy she didn't know. The act touched something in him that he'd thought gone long ago, a chance for hope, for thinking that maybe he wasn't as alone in the world as he'd always thought, whatever her reasons. Whatever game she was playing, Bear found himself thankful for her being there. For the first time in 3 days, the heavy chains didn't feel quite so bad. The trouble had started 3 days before on the mountain path between Cedar Ridge and Silverton. Bear had been coming back from his monthly stuff run, his pack horse full with coffee, salt, and bullets, when he'd heard the gunshots bouncing off the canyon sides. His first thought was to stay out of it. A guy lived longer in the area by not getting into others' messes. But then he'd heard a woman yell. Bear had pulled in his horse and listened close. The sounds were coming from around the next turn in the path, where the trail got narrow between 2 steep rock walls. More shots, men's voices yelling orders, another scared cry from what sounded like a young lady. His old hunting knife felt heavy in its holder as he picked what to do. He'd left his horse tied in a bunch of trees and snuck forward on foot using tricks learned from his Cherokee grandma and made better during the war. The knife was an old pal, its blade smooth from years of use. He'd made it himself during his second winter in the mountains, making the metal from an old army sword and wrapping the handle with skin from his first bear kill. It had been his steady buddy ever since, as much a part of him as his own hands. What he'd found around that turn had made his blood go cold. A nice carriage sat sideways across the thin trail, one wheel over the edge of a 50-foot drop. 3 of the Dalton gang had circled it. He knew Samuel and Jesse Dalton, along with a marked guy called Hutchkins, who was known for being mean even among bad guys. They were scaring a middle-aged guy in a work suit and his daughter, a girl who couldn't be more than 16. "Please," the man was saying, his voice shaky with fear and mad. "Take what you want, but leave my daughter alone." Samuel Dalton, the middle brother and meanest of them, just laughed. He was a tall, thin guy with cold eyes and a smile that never got to them. "We'll take what we want anyway, old man. Question is if you get to watch or not." The girl was pushed against the carriage, tears down her face as Hutchkins got closer to her. She made Bear think of his sister Sarah, who died of sickness when she was just 15. The memory hit him like a hit, bringing back all the blame and sad he'd carried for 25 years. Bear had come out from the rocks like a ghost, the knife showing in his hand like magic. "Let them go," he'd said quiet, his voice having the power of a guy used to being followed. The bad guys had turned fast, surprised by his quick show. Samuel's hand went toward his gun, but Bear was already going. The knife hit Hutchkins in the shoulder, making him stumble back with a yell of hurt. Bear rolled behind the carriage as Samuel's gun fired, the bullet breaking wood close to his head. "You picked wrong, mountain guy," Jesse Dalton called out. He was the youngest brother, barely 20, but already bad. "Should have stayed out of it." "Maybe so," Bear had said back, checking his own gun loads. "But I guess some things are worth the chance." What came next was a short but mean gunfight. Bear had better cover and know-how, but the bad guys had more people in need. Hutchkins, even with his hurt shoulder, got around to the left, while the Dalton brothers kept Bear stuck with steady shots. The knife saved his life again when Hutchkins came from behind. Bear heard the guy's boot scrape on rock and turned just in time to grab the bad guy's wrist, turning his own blade on him. Hutchkins went down hard, his gun falling over the cliff edge. Samuel Dalton messed up by using the girl as cover, grabbing her arm and pressing his gun to her head. "Drop your gun, mountain guy, or she dies." Bear had looked into the girl's scared eyes and seen his sister's face. Without waiting, he'd put 2 bullets in Samuel's chest, the shots so close they sounded like one. The bad guy fell like a rock, his not-fired gun spinning across the rocky ground. Jesse Dalton, seeing his brother drop, lost his guts and ran on horse, leaving Bear alone with the hurt Hutchkins, the thankful family, and one dead bad guy. The girl's dad, a seller named Thompson, had offered to speak for Bear, but Bear waved him off. "Get your daughter safe," he told Thompson. "This place ain't for her." He'd been tying Hutchkins' hurt when Sheriff Bradley showed up with a group. The law guy took one look at Samuel Dalton's body and the hurt bad guy, then set his mean little eyes on Bear. "Jacob McKenna," Bradley had said, his voice full of fake power. "You're under lock for murder." "Murder?" Thompson had said no. "This guy saved our lives. Those bad guys were going to kill us both." But Bradley didn't care about the seller's ords. He had already picked, probably before he got there. Bear saw then that the sheriff had likely been in the Daltons' pay from the start. With Samuel dead and Hutchkins hurt, Bradley needed someone to blame, someone who couldn't point at him and the gang's stuff. "The way I see it," Bradley had said, "this mountain guy started a fight with honest travelers and killed one in cold blood. That's murder to me." Bear hadn't fought when they put the chains on him. He knew the setup was fixed, knew that fighting would only make it worse. But as they put him in the cart for the ride back to Cedar Ridge, he'd felt something die in him. The last bit of trust he'd had in fairness and people being good. The knife had been taken as proof, along with his guns and the few things he'd had on him. Without it, he felt weird naked, like they'd cut off part of his body. That blade had been with him through all. His alone years in the mountains, his meets with wild beasts and bad weather, the quiet times when he'd used it to carve wood by firelight. Now it sat on the judge's quick table, marked as proof in a trial everyone knew was fake. The morning sun coming through the saloon's dirty windows hit the worn metal, making it shine like silver. Bear stared at it, remembering all the times it saved his life, all the ways it helped him live in the wild. But living was different in town, where law could be bought and fair was what the guy with power said. Bear had always known his mountain-safe spot was short-term, that someday the outside world would break his peace. He just hadn't thought it would end like this. Chained in a bar while bad law guy twisted his hero act into reason for killing. The funny part wasn't missed on him. He'd spent 20 years staying away from people, sure that folks would only bring him hurt and let down. The one time he'd stepped up to help. The one time when he'd let his good sense beat his careful. It had got him here facing a hanging rope as he sat in those heavy chains, waiting for Judge Morrison to start the court. Bear found himself thinking about that knife and all it stood for. It was more than just a tool or fight thing. It was a sign of his doing for himself, his skill to live on his own way. Without it, he felt smaller, open in ways that had nothing to do with body danger. The knife had been made in the mountains, shaped by his own hands from bits of his old life. Now it would be proof in the trial that might end all. But somehow, looking at its known shape on that quick judge's table, Bear felt a weird kind of calm. He'd done the right thing on that mountain path, no matter what came next. He'd saved 2 good lives and put down a guy who needed it. If that was worth dying for, then at least he'd meet his end with no bad feelings. The knife would remember even if no one else did. Judge Morrison cleared his throat and hit his gavel on the quick table, though the sound got lost in the low, confused talks that filled Murphy's saloon. Every eye in the room was on the fancy woman who stood in the middle walk, her silk dress a spot of deep blue against the rough wood walls and wood dust floor. "Ma'am," the judge said, careful, fixing his wire glasses. "Did you just say you're married to the guy on trial?" "I did, Your Honor." Victoria's voice went clear through the room, steady and sure, despite the hundreds of stares on her. "My name is Victoria McKenna, and this man is my real husband." Bear felt like lightning hit him. The name meant nothing to him, but the sureness in her voice was total. He looked at her face again, hunting for any sign of knowing, any hidden memory that might make sense of this wild claim. She was pretty, sure, but in a nice way that belonged in fancy rooms and music halls, not in edge bars or mountain huts. Sheriff Bradley pushed through the crowd, his face red with mad. "Judge, this is silly. We've known Jake McKenna for 5 years, and he ain't never said he had a wife. That's because we were apart," Victoria said, smooth, never taking her eyes off the judge. "Jacob left for the area after we got married, and I stayed in Philadelphia to fix family stuff. I've only just got here to be with him again." The lie came so easy, so real that Bear almost believed it too. But questions rolled in his mind like rocks down a hill. Why would this woman, this clear-high lady, risk her good name to help a stranger? What could she possibly get from saying marriage to a mountain loner facing kill charges? Judge Morrison leaned forward, his look worried. "Mrs. McKenna, you know this is a law court. Saying false stuff under promise is lying in court, can get jail." "I get it fully, Your Honor." Victoria reached into her small bead bag and pulled a folded paper. "I have our marriage paper here. If you'd like to check it, the paper she gave the judge looked real enough. Thick with a fancy seal at bottom." Bear watched Judge Morrison's face as he looked at it, seeing the man's mix-up grow. The paper was dated 4 years back from a church in Philadelphia that Bear had never heard of, much less gone to. But as the judge looked at the paper, Bear saw something that made his chest tight. Victoria's hands, which had been so steady when she'd faced the whole courtroom, were shaking now. The small shake was seen only by him from his spot, but it told of nerves and fear hidden under her calm outside. Whatever her reasons for this trick, it was costing her. "Your Honor," Sheriff Bradley said, "no. Anyone can fake a paper." "This whole thing's a trick to slow justice." "Maybe," Judge Morrison said back, putting the paper on his table. "But the law is clear. A man's wife has certain rights about his law stuff, Mrs. McKenna, thinking that's your real name." "What exactly are you asking?" Victoria stood tall, and Bear saw a bit of strong under the silk. "I asked time to get real law help for my husband, Your Honor, and I use my right as his wife to visit him alone before this goes on." Alono went through the crowd. Someone yelled, "Ain't no mountain loner got a wife like that?" Another voice said, "She's probably one of them show ladies from Denver." Judge Morrison raised his hand for quiet. "No matter my own doubts about this marriage, I can't ignore what looks like a law paper. Mrs. McKenna, you can have 15 minutes with the guy. Sheriff Bradley, please take them to your office for a loan." Bradley's face got dark. "Judge, I don't think 15 minutes, Sheriff. That's the law." The walk to Bradley's office felt like a show of wonder and doubt. Townfolks pressed close on both sides, trying to see better the mystery woman and whispering guesses that went from love stuff to silly. Bear walked slow in his chains, super aware of how he must look next to Victoria's clear nice. Bradley's office was in a corner of the main store, split from the shopping by a thin wood wall. It had a beat-up desk, 2 chairs, and a gun holder that had the sheriff's law weapons. The spot smelled of smoke weed, skin, and dirty clothes, a sharp difference to the light flower smell that seemed to follow Victoria. 15 minutes, Bradley growled, standing just outside the open door. "And I'll be hearing every word." Victoria waited till the sheriff stepped back, then got close to Bear's chair. When she talked, her voice was just above a whisper. "My name really is Victoria," she said, her breath warm in his ear. "Victoria Ashworth. I need you to trust me. Why?" Bear's voice was just as quiet, rough from 3 days no talk. "What's this about?" "I can't tell all now, but you saved good people on that mountain path." "Sheriff Bradley is bad, and this whole trial is made to protect the real bad guys." She stopped, looking to the door. "I have reasons for helping you." "Personal reasons?" "What reasons?" Victoria's dark eyes met his, and Bear saw hurt there. Old sad, carefully held, but never forgotten. "My brother died in the war. A horse officer named Thomas Ashworth. Before he died, he wrote about a soldier who saved his life. A man who was supposed to find me after the fights ended, but never did." Bear felt the world tip under him. Thomas Ashworth. The name hit like a hit, bringing back stuff he'd buried deep. A young leader, barely 22, dying on a field doctor spot at Antietam. The boy had grabbed Bear's hand with surprise strength, making him promise to find his sister in Philadelphia to tell her he died thinking of her. Bear had never kept that promise. He'd been hurt himself, sent to different doctor spots. And by the time he'd got better to travel, the idea of facing that young officer's family with news of his death had seemed too hard. He'd told himself she was better not knowing the details. Better mourning without seeing her brother's last times. But now she was here 20 years later, and the heavy of that broken promise sat on his shoulders like heavy metal. "You knew him," Victoria said, seeing the knowing in his face. "I can see it. He wrote about you in his letters. Jacob McKenna, the scout who pulled him out of enemy shots at Sharpsburg." "I should have come," Bear said quiet. "Should have found you after the war, maybe. But you're here now." Victoria looked to the door again, then pushed something into his chained hands. "This is real now, Jacob. The marriage paper is fake, but everything else, the danger you're in, the bad in this town, my need to help you, all of that is true." Bear looked down at the thing she'd put in his palm. It was a small gold locket, old with time. Inside was a picture of a young guy in a horse uniform, his face serious but nice. Thomas Ashworth, just as Bear remembered him. "He gave me that locket the last time I saw him," Victoria said before he left for the war. "He was so young, so sure he was going to change the world. He was a good soldier," Bear said, his voice thick with feeling. "Brave. He died trying to save his men." Tears came in Victoria's eyes, but she blinked them away. "I know. I've always known, but I needed to hear it from someone who was there." The 15 minutes went like beats. They talked in whispers about Thomas, about the war, about the 20 years that had gone between that fight promise and this time. Bear learned that Victoria had never married, that she'd given herself to handling her family's business after her parents died, that she'd spent years wondering about the soldier her brother had written about. When Sheriff Bradley came back to take them to the courtroom, something had changed between them. The trick stayed. Victoria was not really his wife. The marriage paper was fake, but the link was real, made in shared sad and the memory of a young guy who died too far from home. As they walked back through the wondering crowd, Bear found himself standing taller despite the chain weight. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't fully alone. Someone knew his tale, got his heavy, and had picked to stand with him despite the risk. The fake marriage paper might be a lie, but the bond it stood for was becoming something much more mixed than either had thought. That evening, Victoria sat in a room at the Cedar Ridge Hotel, a skin-bound book open on the small right desk before her. The stay spot was hardly what she was used to. The bed was bumpy, the walls thin to hear every talk in next rooms, and the one window looked on the muddy main street rather than the nice gardens of her Philadelphia home. But she'd picked to come here to this rough-edge town where her brother's ghost had finally led her. She dipped her pen in the ink and started to write, as she had every evening for the past 15 years. October 15th, 1885. Dear Thomas, I found him today. The soldier you wrote about. The one who saved your life at Sharpsburg. His name is Jacob McKenna, though everyone here calls him Bear. He's just as you said, tall and strong, with eyes that have seen too much. But also kind. Despite what this place has done to him, he's in bad trouble, Thomas. They want to hang him for doing the right thing, for saving good people just as he saved you. I couldn't let that happen. Not when I finally found him after all these years of looking. I did something today that would shock Mom and Dad. I said I was his wife, made fake papers to make it seem real. I know it's wrong, but sometimes wrong acts serve right goals. You taught me that, didn't you? When you lied about your age to join. When you told me you were going to glory instead of saying you might die. Victoria stopped, her pen over the page as memories came back. She'd been 17 when Thomas left for the war, old enough to get the danger, but too young to take it. He'd been her guard since kids, the one person who'd never treated her like a weak flower, to be kept from the world's hard stuff. Their parents had been nice but far more caring about their ship business and social stuff than with their kids' inner lives. Thomas had filled that empty, teaching her to ride like a boy, to read past the okay books for young girls, to think for herself, even when people said no to such free for women. When he died at Antietam, her world fell apart. The official note had been short and not personal. Lieutenant Thomas Ashworth killed in fight while leading his men in a rush against South Spots. No details, no own words, nothing to help her get how someone so full of life could just stop. For years, she'd wondered about his last times. Had he been scared? Had he thought of home? Had anyone been with him? Or had he died alone among strangers? The letters he'd sent during his months of work had been her only hint. In them, he'd written about the other soldiers. Farm kids from Ohio, shop guys from Pennsylvania, new folks chasing the American dream with guns in hands. But one name had come up a lot. Jacob McKenna, a scout and good shooter who seemed to have made himself Thomas's not-official guard. He's older than the rest of us, Thomas had written. Maybe 30 or so, and he knows this land like he was born to it. The other boys call him Bear because he's built like one and just as bad when mad. But he's got a soft side, too. Spent half the night helping young Peters write a letter to his girl. And yesterday I saw him carving a wood horse for a kid in one of the runaway camps. In another letter dated just weeks before Antietam, Bear pulled me out of a bad spot today. South shooters had us stuck, and I would have died if he hadn't come back for me. He says it's what soldiers do for each other, but I think it's more. There's something in his eyes, Vic, a sad that goes deeper than this war. I think he's lost people, too. Maybe everyone who mattered to him. When this is over, I want to find a way to help him, to give him the family he seems to have lost. The last letter had come 2 days before the fight that killed him. If something happens to me, Vic, I want you to find Bear Jacob McKenna from Colorado area. He needs to know he's not as alone in the world as he thinks. Promise me you'll find him. But the war had spread men like leaves in a storm. By the time Victoria was old enough and free enough to start looking, Jacob McKenna had gone into the big of the American edge. She'd hired lookers, put ads in area papers, even went west herself and sometimes. But the guy had gone as full as if the ground ate him until 3 days ago, when she'd heard 2 travelers in a Denver hotel talking about a mountain guy named Bear McKenna, who'd been locked for killing a member of the Bad Dalton gang. Victoria had been in Denver on business, finishing the sale of her family's ship stuff to a other company. At 37, she'd never married despite lots of guys asking, picking instead to focus on keeping and growing the Ashworth money. She'd become one of the richest, not-married women in Philadelphia, a spot that gave her free but also a kind of a loan she rarely said. The pick to sell the business had been hard but needed. She got tired of the endless social musts. The careful moves needed to win in a man's world while keeping proper girl looks. The edge had always called to her. Maybe because Thomas died fighting for it, or maybe because it stood for the kind of free women rarely found in nice society. She'd bought a ride to Cedar Ridge that very night. Now sitting in this bad hotel room with her book open before her, Victoria felt closer to her brother than she had in 20 years. Finding Jacob McKenna hadn't brought Thomas back, but it had given her a chance to honor his memory in a way that mattered. She went back to her writing. The guy they call Bear is nothing like I thought, Thomas. The years have marked him. He's grayer now, more worn with lines around his eyes that talk of long alone. But there's still kindness in him, still that soft strength you wrote about. When he looked at me today, really looked at me, I felt like he was seeing not just Victoria Ashworth, the Philadelphia rich, but someone worth guarding. It's been so long since anyone looked at me that way. I know you'd like what I'm doing, even if the ways are iffy. That bad sheriff wants Jacob dead, and the Dalton gang won't stop till they've paid back their fallen brother. But I have stuff they don't think of, links they can't beat. I've already sent word to my law guy in Philadelphia to send money for real law help. And I've talked to a federal law guy I met at a help event last year. The marriage trick bothers me. I'll say it goes against all we were taught about truth and right ways. But right ways never saved anyone's life, did it? Sometimes the right thing needs us to step out of society's nice little rules. Victoria put down her pen and went to the window, looking at the quiet main street. Most of the town was asleep now, though lamplight still showed in the bar windows, and she could hear the far sound of a piano playing a sad song. Somewhere in this town, Jacob McKenna was locked in a cell, probably wondering what kind of crazy woman had said she was his wife. She'd seen the mix-up in his eyes, the tired of a guy who'd learned not to trust surprise nice. But she'd also seen knowing when she'd said Thomas, and something that might have been thanks when she'd pushed that locket into his hands. The locket had been her best thing for 20 years, the only real link to her brother's memory. Giving it to Jacob had felt right, like finishing a circle that had been broken since Antietam. A soft knock at her door broke her thoughts. Victoria got tense. It was almost 10, too late for any right visit. In Philadelphia, such a come would be bad talk. Here it might be danger. "Who is it?" she called soft. "Martha Morrison," came the answer. "The judge's wife, well, his late wife's sister. Might I have a word?" Victoria opened the door to find a woman of maybe 50, dressed in simple but clean clothes and carrying a small basket. Martha Morrison had kind eyes and gray hair fixed in a useful bun, the sort of woman who was a town's not official mom. "I hope you'll forgive the late time," Martha said. "But I wanted to talk with you alone, away from nosy eyes and talking mouths." Victoria stepped aside to let her in. "Of course, please sit down." Martha sat in the room's one chair and looked at Victoria straight. "I'll talk plain if you don't mind. Are you really married to Jacob McKenna?" The question stayed in the air between them like smoke from a shot. Victoria thought about lying, keeping the trick she'd worked hard on. But something in Martha's eyes said lying would be no use and not smart. "No," Victoria said quiet. "I'm not." Martha nodded like she'd thought that. "I figured not. Jacob's lived alone in those mountains for 20 years. A guy doesn't keep a wife secret that long, not in a place where everyone knows everyone else's stuff. Are you going to tell on me?" "That depends," Martha said, "on why you're really here." So Victoria told her about Thomas, about the letters, about 20 years of looking for the guy who'd saved her brother's life. Martha listened no stop, her look getting thoughtful. "Your brother sounds like he was a good guy," Martha said at last. "And Jacob McKenna saved my nephew's life once, pulled him out of a river when the ice broke. He's a good guy, too, whatever that dumb Bradley says. Then you'll help me." Martha was quiet for a long time, thinking there's something you should know about this town. Mrs. Ashworth about the Dalton gang and why Sheriff Bradley is so quick to see Jacob hang. "I'm listening. The Daltons have been taking from this area for 2 years. They rob, they steal, they scare good folks, and Bradley always is somewhere else when they hit. Most of us think he's taking money from them, but we can't show it. And now that Jacob killed one of them. Now Bradley needs a blame guy, someone to point at for Samuel Dalton's death who can't point at him in their crimes." Martha leaned forward. "But there's more. Eli Dalton, Samuel's older brother. He's not going to let this go. Gang boss or not, he loved that boy. Word is he's riding to Cedar Ridge with a dozen men, planning to take Jacob from the jail and make a show of him." Victoria felt ice in her belly. "When?" "Soon, maybe tomorrow. Maybe the next day. That's why Bradley's pushing for a fast trial. He wants Jacob dead before Eli gets here so he can say he was just doing the law." The two women looked at each other in the lamplight, passing between them like a shared heavy. "What can we do?" Victoria asked. Martha smiled, and Victoria saw a bit of the strong that had helped this woman live on the edge. "Well, Mrs. McKenna," she said with on-purpose stress, "I guess we better make sure your husband gets a fair trial. And after that, we better help him stay alive long enough to like it." The morning sun threw long shadows across. Bear's cell when Victoria came with breakfast and something that made his heart jump. Thomas Ashworth's Army Medal. The bronze cross lay heavy in her hand. Its ribbon faded, but the words still clear. For brave-littered Thomas Ashworth, Pennsylvania horse. He earned this at Gettysburg, Victoria said quiet, passing the medal through the bars along with a plate of eggs and meat from the hotel kitchen, 3 months before Antietam. Before he met you, Bear took the medal with careful hands, his rough fingers following the raised letters. The heavy of it brought back memories he tried to bury. The smell of gun stuff and blood. The sounds of dying guys calling for moms. The bad duty of picking who lived and who died in the mess hall fight. I remember when they gave it to him, Bear said, his voice rough with feeling. He was shy by the notice. Said was just doing his job. That sounds like Thomas. Victoria sat on a wood box that was the only chair in the small jail. Sheriff Bradley had let her come daily with Mad, though he always stood where he could hear. He never could take praise easy. Bear looked at the medal, remembering the young officer who'd worn it with not-want pride. Thomas Ashworth had been everything Bear wasn't. Schooled, nice, from a good family with wants and musts. But war had a way of taking away such diffs, making men to their basic selves. He talked about you all the time, Victoria went on, her voice low so Bradley couldn't hear from his desk. About your sister, your plans after the war. He was going to help you rebuild, maybe find you work with his family's ship business. He was a dreamer, Bear said, though not mean. Thought the world was better than it is. Maybe. Or maybe he saw what it could be. Victoria leaned closer to the bars. Jacob, I need to tell you something about why Thomas's death changed me so much. Bear looked up from the medal, seeing hurt in her dark eyes that went deeper than simple sad. We weren't just brother and sister, Victoria said. We were twins, born minutes apart, Thomas first, then me. We shared everything growing up. Our parents were far people, nice enough, but more into their business than their kids. Thomas and I raised each other in many ways. The news hit Bear like a hit. Twins. That explained the strong of her sad. The way she'd carried Thomas's memory for 20 years. Like a holy job. He'd known soldiers who'd lost brothers. But losing a twin must be like losing half your soul. When he died, Victoria went on, I felt it. I was in Philadelphia ETA Ladies' Help meeting, and suddenly I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I knew something bad had happened before we got the wire. Bear nodded slow. He'd heard like tales from other soldiers, family sensing death across big spaces, links that beat normal think. I've spent 20 years trying to fill the empty he left. Victoria said, handling the family business, getting in help work, anything to stay busy, but nothing helped. Nothing made the alone go away until you found me, until I found you. She reached through the bars to touch his hand quick. Finding you didn't bring Thomas back, but it gave me a goal I'd forgotten I needed. A chance to honor his memory by helping someone he cared about. Bear felt something move in his chest, a tight that had been there so long he'd forgotten it was weird. I should have come to you after the war. Should have kept my promise to him. You were hurt too, Jacob. I've looked over the years. I know about your hurts, about the months you spent in Army doctor spots. You had your own getting better to handle. Still should have come. Victoria smiled, and Bear saw bits of her brother in the look. Thomas wouldn't have blamed you. He got that sometimes stuff make it hard to keep every promise. They sat in comfy quiet for a bit, the heavy of shared memories sitting between them like an old pal. Outside, Cedar Ridge was waking. The sounds of horses and carts, voices saying morning hellos, the steady beat of an edge town starting another day. There's something else, Victoria said, looking to Sheriff Bradley's desk. Martha Morrison told me last night that Eli Dalton is riding this way with a bunch of men. They want payback for Samuel's death. Bear nodded bad. He'd been waiting for something like this. Gang bosses didn't let killing a family go without answer, especially not when it happened with watchers. Eli Dalton had a name for smart mean. He wouldn't be happy with simple hanging. When? Bear asked. Soon. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. Victoria's voice had a shake she couldn't hide. Martha thinks Bradley wants this trial over fast, so he can say he was just doing law when Eli comes. Bear turned the medal in his hands, feeling the heavy of 20 years of blame and sorry. Thomas Ashworth had he'd believing in fair, in the idea that good guys could make change in a not-perfect world. Now his sister was risking all to save a guy she barely knew, all because of promises made on a fight field long ago. You should go, Bear said quiet. Take the next ride back to Denver. This ain't your fight. It became my fight when I walked into that courtroom. Victoria's voice had strong under the silk. Besides, I have pluses that Bradley doesn't think. Money, links, and stuff he can't match. Money won't stop a bullet. No, but it can hire people who know how to handle bullets. Victoria looked around to make sure Bradley wasn't hearing, then leaned closer. I've sent word to a federal law guy. I know he should get here in the week. Bear felt a bit of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, but know-how taught him to watch such feelings. A week might be too late. Then we'll have to make sure you last till he gets here. Victoria stood fixing her dress. Judge Morrison is a true guy, Jacob. If we can get you a fair trial, show the real proof, show what kind of guy you really are. What kind of guy am I? The question came out more bitter than Bear meant. A killer who's been hiding in the mountains for 20 years. Victoria looked at his face through the bars, her look serious. You're the guy who saved my brother's life. The guy who risked all to guard good people on that mountain path. The guy who carved toys for runaway kids in the middle of a war. She stopped. You're the guy Thomas saw when he looked at you. Someone worth saving. Bear felt his throat tight. He'd spent so many years thinking of himself as a guy apart. Someone whose skill for fight made him not fit for nice company. But Victoria saw something else. Something her brother had seen too. Thomas believed in getting better. Victoria went on. He used to say that every guy deserved a chance to be better than his worst time, even if he never got the chance to help you himself. Maybe I can do it for him. The sound of boots on the wood walk outside got their notice. Sheriff Bradley looked up from his desk as Deputy Collins came in, his young face red with excite and fear. Sheriff, Collins said a bit out of breath. Riders coming from north, maybe 8 or 10 of them going fast. Bradley's face went white. Eli Dalton can't tell yet, but Collins swallowed hard. One of them's flying a black flag. Victoria felt ice in her belly. Even she knew what a black flag meant on the edge. No give, no nice shown. Eli Dalton wasn't coming toe-talk or ask fair through law ways. He was coming for blood. Bear stood in his cell, every gut honed by years of living suddenly ready. How long before they get to town? Maybe an hour, Collins said back. They stopped at Miller's farm, probably to water horses and ask stuff. Bradley started walking behind his desk, his usual big talk replaced by clear fear. This is bad. This is real bad. If Eli Dalton rides into Cedar Ridge looking for payback, then give him what he wants, Bear said quiet. Open the cell. Let me walk out and face him. No point getting good people hurt. No. Victoria's voice snapped like a whip. No way. You're not giving yourself up to save a bad sheriff who helped make this mess. Bradley turned fast, his face red with mad and fear. Lady, you don't get what you're dealing with. Eli Dalton don't care about your fancy clothes or money. He'll burn this whole town to get McKenna. Then maybe it's time this town stood up to him, Victoria said even. How many years have you let the Daltons scare these people? How much blood is on your hands because you were too scared or too greedy to do your job? The blame stayed in the air like smoke from a shot. Bradley's hand went begut toward his gun, but he stopped when he saw Bear watching through the bars. Careful, Sheriff, Bear said soft. Threat a lady won't help your spot. Deputy Collins looked back and forth between them, mix-up clear on his young face. He was maybe 22, new to the job, and probably not knowing his boss is bad. Sheriff, what do we do? If Eli Dalton's coming here, we follow the law. Judge Morrison's voice came from the door. The small, tidy guy came into the jail office, his look bad but set. Deputy Collins, I want every guy who can fight armed and ready. We're not giving anyone to wild law takers. Judge, you can't be real, Bradley said no. It's 8 or 10 armed guys against a whole town, Morrison cut in. Cedar Ridge has maybe 40 guys who can use weapons. The Daltons have been scaring this area for 2 years because people were too scared or too alone to fight back. Maybe it's time we showed them what group fight looks like. Bear felt something move in his chest, a feeling he hadn't felt since the war, the sense of being part of something bigger than himself, of fighting with guys who shared same goal. Judge, I like what you're trying, but nothing, Mr. McKenna. You're in my keep under the guard of this court. No gang of bad guys is going to change that. Morrison's eyes flashed behind his glasses. Besides, I've been reading the proof in your case. The more I look, the more sure I am that you acted in right guard of good people. Victoria felt her heart jump. Does that mean it means we're going to have a real trial with real proof and real watchers? Morrison said back, starting this afternoon if Mr. McKenna's willing. Bear looked at the medal still held in his hands, thinking about the young officer who'd earned it with blood and brave. Thomas Ashworth had died fighting for right, never seeing if his give made any diff. Maybe it was time to find out. "I'm willing," Bear said. The dusty floorboards of Bear's cell creaked as he walked the narrow spot, his mind fighting with memories and feelings he'd kept buried for 20 years. Victoria had left him with more than just Thomas's medal. She'd given him a bunch of letters tied with a faded blue string, letters between the Ashworth twins that somehow had bits about him. Bear sat heavy on the cell's one bed and carefully opened the first letter. The paper was yellow with age, the ink a bit light, but Thomas's neat writing was still red. "My dear Victoria, the fights have been bad these past weeks, but I wanted you to know I'm safe, mostly due to a great guy I've had the luck to work with. His name is Jacob McKenna, though the other soldiers call him Bear. He's maybe the best scout I've met. And more than that, he has a kind of character that seems rare in these dark times. Yesterday, he spent his whole evening helping young Murphy write a letter to his girl back in Ohio. The boy can barely spell his name, but Bear sat with him patient, helping him find words to say what's in his heart. Watching them, I was reminded of the better parts of us that this war sometimes makes us forget. I've been thinking about what we'll do when this fight ends. Dad expects me to go back to Philadelphia and take my place in the business, but I find myself wondering if there isn't some bigger goal I might do. Bear talks sometimes of the areas of wide-open spots where a guy might build something big from nothing. Maybe there's chance there for both of us." Bear's hands shook a bit as he put the letter aside. Tosi himself through Thomas's eyes, not as a killer or loner, but as someone worth liking, shook something loose in his chest that had been locked since the war ended. The next letter was from Victoria to Thomas, her girl writing flowing across the page with clear like, "Dear brother, your letters about Mr. McKenna got me very curious. He sounds like just the kind of guy Dad says doesn't exist anymore. Honorable without being too holy, strong without being mean. I say I find myself wondering about this edge scout who has so got my real brother. If he really means to look for luck in the areas after the war, maybe you might get him to visit Philadelphia first. I should very much like to meet the guy who's been watching over you in my not there. Besides, someone with his clear skills might find chances with Dad's ship stuff." Bear felt a weird tight in his throat. Victoria had been thinking about him even before they met, seeing chances he'd never thought for himself. The woman who'd walked into that courtroom hadn't been a full stranger after all. She'd been carrying an idea of him made through her brother's letters and her own big think. The sound of loud voices from the street pulled his notice away from the letters. Through the small barred window, Bear could see town folks gathering in worried groups, their faces tight with worry and set. Word of Eli Dalton's coming had spread fast, and Cedar Ridge was getting ready for a fight. Deputy Collins showed at the cell door, his young face serious. "Mr. McKenna, Judge Morrison wants to see you. Says it's time for that trial." Bear carefully folded the letters and put them with Thomas's medal in his shirt pocket, close it to his heart. As Collins unlocked the cell, Bear saw the deputy's hands were steady despite the clear stress of the spot. "You scared, kid?" Bear asked as they walked to the quick courtroom. Collins thought the question real. "Yes, sir, but Judge Morrison says being scared don't matter as much as doing right when it counts." Bear nodded yes. "Your judge is a wise guy." The saloon had been changed again into a courtroom, but the air was buzzing with stress. Every seat full, and men stood along walls holding guns. Victoria sat in front, her fancy dress a big diff to the rough-edged clothes around her. But Bear saw she'd taken the same set look as the men getting ready to guard their town. Judge Morrison called for order, his voice having surprise power in the charged air. "Ladies and guys, we are here topic the guilty or not of Jacob McKenna in the thing of Samuel Dalton's death. No matter outside threats or push, this court will do, itself by law and proof." Sheriff Bradley stood slow to show the blame side's case, but his usual big was gone. "The guy killed Samuel Dalton on the mountain path 3 days ago. That's murder, simple. Were there watchers to this said murder?" Judge Morrison asked. "Well, yes, there were some travelers, but then call them to speak." Bradley's face got red. "They've left town." Judge went on to Denver. A low talk went through the crowd. Victoria got up smooth from her seat. "Your Honor, if I may, I think I can find these watchers if given enough time. The court likes your offer, Mrs. McKenna, but we have more now worries." Morrison turned to Bear. "Mr. McKenna, how do you say to the charge of murder?" Bear stood as straight as his chains let. "Not guilty, Your Honor. I was guarding good people from armed take and attack. Can you tell the court just what happened on that mountain path?" For the next 30 minutes, Bear told the events in careful detail. He said hearing the woman's yell, finding the Dalton gang scaring the family, his pick toe step in despite the risk to himself. The courtroom listened in full quiet, hanging on every word. When Hedoni, Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. McKenna, in your army work, did you ever get teaching in the rules of fight about guarding normal people?" "Yes, sir. We were taught that soldiers have a job to guard good normal when can, even at own risk. And you thought this spot to fall under those rules?" "I did, Your Honor. Those people were going to be taken and likely killed. The young woman was in right now danger of attack or worse." Martha Morrison got up from her seat near back. "Your Honor, might I say something?" "Mrs. Morrison, Jacob McKenna saved my nephew's life 4 years ago. Billy fell through ice on Miller Creek in middle winter. Jacob pulled him out and carried him 2 miles through a snowstorm to get doctor help. He never asked for thanks or pay, just made sure Billy was safe and went on." Other voices joined from around the room. "He helped me find thieves that took my cows," yelled a farm guy named Peterson. "Wouldn't take a cent for it." "Guided my boy home when he got lost hunting," added another guy. "He could have charged plenty, but said it was just neighbor thing." Judge Morrison listened to speak after speak, his look getting more thoughtful with each. At last he raised his hand for quiet. "Based on the proof shown, and no blame watchers to say against the guy's tale, I find the charge of murder without enough base. But given the coming threat to this group, I'm putting off final pick until the courtroom doors burst open with a bang that made everyone reach for weapons." But instead of Eli Dalton and his gang, a guy in a federal law badge walked in, his long coat dusty from hard ride. "Marshal Andrew Fletcher for the area gov," he said in a voice that had clear power. "I have papers for lock of Eli Dalton and his buddies on charges of take, kill, and scaring area people." Victoria felt her heart jump. The law guy she'd reached had come sooner than thought, bringing the heavy of Fed law to the spot. "Marshal Fletcher," Judge Morrison said, relief in his voice. "Your time is perfect. We were just ending a trial linked to the Dalton gang stuff." Fletcher's eyes swept the room, taking in the armed town folks and the clear stress. "I get there may be a face-off coming. How many men is Dalton bringing?" "Maybe 10, Deputy Collins said back. "They're flying a black flag," the marshal nodded bad. "Then they're not planning to take caught. But they're also not thinking to face Fed power backed by Group Guard." He looked at Bear, still in chains at the blame table. "You must be Jacob McKenna. Mrs. Ashworth's wire said your spot." "Marshal," Bear said with respect. "From what I've heard, you did the area a help by killing Samuel Dalton." "The guy was wanted for at least 3 kills that I know." Fletcher turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like toast that Mr. McKenna be let into my keep. A guy of his might be useful in the coming face-off." Judge Morrison didn't wait. "Deputy Collins, take off Mr. McKenna's chains. Mr. McKenna, you're free waiting final end of the charges against you." As the iron chains fell from his wrists and feet, Bear felt 20 years of spirit-heavy lift, too. He moved his hands, feeling power back to his arms, but more, feeling goal back to his life. Victoria came as the courtroom started to empty, people getting ready for the coming fight. "Jacob, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Bear said quiet, looking out the window to the coming dust cloud on the far. "These people stood for me when they had every reason not to. It's time I gave back." He looked down at Thomas's medal, still pressed on his chest in his shirt pocket. Maybe this was the goal Thomas had seen in him all those years ago. Not just the skill to live alone, but the strength to stand with others when it mattered. The Dalton gang was coming to Cedar Ridge, thinking to find a scared town ready to give their caught. Instead, they were about to find what happens when good people pick they've had enough of fear. The afternoon sun threw long shadows across Cedar Ridge's main street when Victoria made a find that changed all. She'd gone back to her hotel room to get extra bullets for the town's guards when she saw something odd about Thomas's last letter. The one she'd carried for 20 years without really checking closed the cover or 2 mail marks. Victoria had always thought Thomas's last letter had been sent straight from his group. But now she could see there were really 2 stamps, 2 diff dates. The first was from Antietam, Maryland, dated September 15, 1862, 2 days before the fight. But there was another mark under from Washington, D.C., dated October 3rd, nearly 3 weeks later with shaking fingers. Victoria carefully opened the cover and took not one letter, but woo. The first was the goodbye letter she'd read lots, Thomas's last words to his loved sister. But folded behind was another page she'd never seen in writing she didn't know. "Miss Ashworth, my name is Jacob McKenna. I was with your brother when he died at Antietam. He asked me to write to you to tell you how he passed and to give his personal stuff. This is the hardest letter I've ever wrote. Thomas talked of you all the time in his last hours. He was proud of your strength. You're free. You're no to be bound by what people think a woman should be. He said, you had the brave of 10 men and the heart of an angel. He died saving his men, Miss Ashworth. South shooters had pinned his group, and Thomas led a rush to break their spot. He took a bullet meant for a young private named Davies, pushed the boy to safe even as he fell. He lived long enough to know his men were safe. Before he died, he made me promise 2 things. First, that I would find you and make sure you knew he died thinking of you. Second, that I would ask if you might think marriage to a guy who loved your brother like family and would spend his life trying to be worth Thomas's memory. I know this is bold of me, Miss Ashworth. I'm a common soldier with no future, no school, nothing to give a lady of your level. But Thomas thought we would fit, said we shared the same quiet strength, the same set to do right, even when it cost dear. If you're willing to think his ask, I'll be in Philadelphia after my leave from the doctor. If not, please know that carrying Thomas's memory will be honor enough for my days. Your helper, Jacob McKenna, Victoria, sank on the bed, the letter shaking in her hands. Thomas hadn't just wrote about Jacob McKenna. Hettried to set a marriage between them from his deathbed. And Jacob had agreed, had been willing to go to Philadelphia to court a woman he'd never met just out of love for his fallen pal. But the letter had never got. A 3rd paper fell from the cover. An official Army paper dated October 15, 1862. Victoria knew the style from her family's business. Deals with gov contracts. It was a lost report listing Jacob McKenna as missing in fight, thought dead. The bits of a 20-year-old bad fell in place. Jacob had wrote the letter but had been hurt again before he could send. Some good clear at the Army doctor had sent Thomas's last letter with Jacob's, not getting they were separate rights. By the time Jacob got better, he'd probably been told his letter to Victoria Ashworth had been sent with news of her brother's death. He'd thought she'd got his ask and picked not to answer. She'd thought he'd just gone, leaving his promise to Thomas without why. 20 years of apart, of wondering what might have, all because of a file mistake in an Army doctor. Victoria pressed the letter to her chest, feeling the heavy of lost chances. If Jacob's letter had got her in 1862, would she have took? She'd been 19. Heartbroken by Thomas's death, super alone in a world that suddenly felt empty and no mean. The chance of marrying a guy her loved brother had picked for her, someone who got the deep of her loss, she probably would have said yes. The sound of gunshots from Thief Street below broke her think. Victoria rushed to the window and saw riders coming into town from the north end of Main Street. Eli Dalton had come, and the fight for Cedar Ridge was about to start. But first, she had to find Jacob. Victoria grabbed her small pearl-handle small gun from her travel case, a gift from her dad years ago when she'd started travel for business and ran for the stairs. The hotel front was mess with guests and workers blocking windows and putting out lamps to avoid getting shots. "Mrs. McKenna," Martha Morrison called from behind the front desk. "Get away from those windows." Victoria ignored the warn and pushed through the hotel's front doors onto the woodwalk. The street was a war spot. Town folks shooting from doors and second-floor windows. Bad guys on horse shooting back as they tried to hold the main road. The sharp smell of gun stuff filled the air, mixing with dust and yells of hurt horses. She spotted Jacob right away. He was set behind a water holder near the jail. Careful shooting at the coming riders with the "gun someone gave him." Even at this far, Victoria could see the diff in his moves. The careful exact of a no soldier. Each shot on purpose and good. Marshal Fletcher was 20 yards to Jacob's left, using the corner of the main store for cover as he tried to lead the town's guard. Deputy Collins was with him, the young guy's face white but set as he reloaded his big gun. "Jacob," Victoria called out, but her voice got lost in the noise of fight. One of Dalton's men turned his horse toward the hotel, seeming to pick to stop threats from that way. Victoria saw the bad guy lift his gun toward her and acted on pure gut, lifting her small gun and pulling the trigger. The small gun jumped in her hand, and the bad guy spun from his seat with a yell of surprise and hurt. The short break was enough for Jacob to put a bullet through the guy's chest, ending the threat for good. Their eyes met across the mess of the street, and Victoria saw something change in Jacob's look. He'd seen her guard herself, seen her stand and fight instead of hiding safe. The knowing in his gaze told her he was remembering a diff woman, one who'd been brave enough to think marrying a stranger based only on her brother's say. "Get to cover!" Jacob yelled across the street, pointing to the barn at the far end of town. This ain't over yet. But Victoria was already moving, not to safe, but to the jail where Jacob was fighting. She had 20 years of words to say to him, 20 years of mix-ups to clear. And she wasn't going to let Eli Dalton's gang stop that talk. As she ran across the street, dodging bullets and jumping over stuff, Victoria held Jacob's long-lost letter in her free hand. The marriage paper she'd faked might have been a lie when she made it, but the feelings it stood for, the link she'd felt to this guy she'd never met, had been real from the start. Thomas had seen what they could be together, even across the hard gap of war and stuff. Now it was up to Victoria and Jacob to pick if his C had been worth 20 years of waiting. A bullet went past her ear as she dove behind the water holder next to Jacob, landing hard on the dusty ground. He reached to steady her, his strong hand warm on her arm. "Are you hit?" he asked, his voice rough with worry and something else, something that might have been knowing of chances neither had dared to name. "No," Victoria gasped, pressing the letter into his hand. "But I need you to read this. I need you to get why I really came here." Jacob looked down at the yellow paper, his eyes getting big as he knew his own writing from 2 decades ago. For a bit, the fight around them seemed to fade as the heavy of missed chances and lost chances sat between them like a bridge finally built across a 20-year gap. "You never got it," he said, getting flooding his voice. "And you never got my answer," Victoria said back, looking into his eyes with a strong that had nothing to do with the gunfight going around them. Above the sound of shots and yelling guys, Jacob McKenna heard something he'd thought lost forever, the sound of his own heart learning to hope again. The fight for Cedar Ridge had been going for 30 minutes when Eli Dalton called for a short-stop fire. His voice went across the bullets-scarred Main Street with the power of a Gaius to being followed even by his foes. McKenna Dalton yelled from his spot behind the flipped stagecoach at the north end of town. "I know you can hear me, mountain guy." Bear looked up from reloading his gun. Sweat and gun stuff left streaking his face. Beside him, Victoria was careful checking the loads in the spare guns they'd got from the jail's weapon holder. Her fancy dress was torn and dusty, but her hands were steady and her eyes clear. "What do you want, Dalton?" Bear called back. "I want the guy who killed my brother." Eli's voice cracked with sad and mad. "Send him out and the rest of this town can live." Marshal Fletcher, crouched behind the main store's load spot, shook his head bad. "Don't believe him, McKenna. Dalton's got Fed papers in his head. He can't leave watchers." Bear knew the marshal was right. Eli Dalton was stuck now, facing Fed law and a group guard, instead of the spread, scared groups he usually heaten. A guy in that spot became needy, and needy guys made the worst kind of foe. "I got a other offer," Bear yelled. "You and your boys ride out now, and maybe some of you live to see tomorrow." Dalton's laugh had no fun. "You killed Samuel, you son of my baby brother." He was just 19 years old. Victoria felt a bit of surprise feel bad. "She got the sad of losing a sib the way it could eat all else in your life." But Samuel Dalton had been scaring good people, threatening that young girl on the mountain path. Sometimes good people died young, and sometimes bad did too. "Your brother was about to attack a good girl," Bear said back, his voice going across the sudden quiet. "I gave him a chance to walk away. He picked to fight. He picked to die," Eli yelled back. "And now you're going to join him." The sound of breaking glass from the hotel made everyone turn. 2 of Dalton's men were climbing through a second-floor window trying to get behind the town's guard line. Deputy Collins saw them first and put a big gun blast through the window, sending both bad guys falling back into the street. "They're trying to side us," Marshal Fletcher said bad. "Won't be long before they can use the back ways to get around us." Bear looked at the fight spot with the eye of a old soldier. Cedar Ridge's main street was maybe 300 yards long, lined with wood buildings that gave okay cover, but could also burn if someone got smart with oil and matches. The town folks were fighting brave, but they were store guys and farmers, not soldiers. Against no bad guys, brave alone wouldn't be enough. "We need to end this fast," Bear said, checking his bullets. "Before they think they can burn us out," Victoria looked at him sharp. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about something your brother taught me in the war." Bear pulled Thomas's medal from his shirt pocket, the bronze catching the afternoon sun. "Sometimes the best guard is a good attack." Judge Morrison, who'd been leading bullet supplies from the safe of the jail, heard the talk. "Mr. McKenna, you're not real thinking going out there alone?" "No." Bear looked around at the faces watching him. Town folks who'd stood up for him when they had every reason not to. A Fed law guy who'd rode hard to bring fair to their group. A woman who'd risked all to save a guy she barely knew. I'm thinking going out there with pals. Martha Morrison showed at the judge's arm, her gray hair coming out from its useful bun, but her eyes sharp with set. What do you need? Tricks. Something to split their notice while a small group gets close enough to end this. Bear turned to Marshall Fletcher. How many men can you give for a side move? 3, maybe 4, Fletcher said after a beat think. But that leaves the main line pretty weak. Won't matter if we can take out Eli Dalton and break their lead. Bear said, these ain't soldiers. They're following one guy out of want and fear. Take him and they'll run. Victoria looked at the setup of buildings, her mind working through chances with the same plan thinking that had made her good in business. The barn behind Murphy's bar? If you could get there without seen, you'd have a clear shot at their spot. Getting there's the problem, Deputy Collins pointed out. It's 200 yards of open ground. Not if we make enough noise and mess from this end, Victoria said, thoughtful. Draw their notice while you move. Bear looked at her with growing like. The fancy lady from Philadelphia was thinking like a fight old, seeing sides and chances that even some guys had missed. It could work, Marshall Fletcher agreed slow, but it's danger as heck. One mess and you're caught in open with no run. Then we better not make messes. Bear checked his weapons one last time. The gun someone had given him. A pair of guns taken from the jail's gun rack and a knife borrowed from the hotel kitchen. It wasn't his known hunting blade, but it would work if things got close. Victoria caught his arm as he got ready to move. Jacob, wait. She pulled something from her dress pocket. A small gold wedding band, simple and no fancy. This was my mom's. I've carried it for 20 years, never knowing why. Bear looked at the ring, getting the act, but not quite believing. Victoria, I know this ain't the time or place, she said fast. But I need you to know that letter you wrote, the ask Thomas had you make, my answer would have been yes. It would have been yes then, and it's yes now. The world seemed to stop around them, despite the mess of the gunfight. Bear took the ring with hands that weren't steady, feeling the heavy of 20 years of what-ifs and might-haves. When this is over, he said quiet, we'll talk about what that means. Really talk, not just the needy words of people facing death. When this is over, Victoria agreed. We'll have all the time. Bear slipped the ring on his little finger, the only one small to hold it safe. Then he kissed Victoria's head, a soft act that somehow carried more heavy than big hugs. Marshall, Bear said, turning back to work. Give me 10 minutes to get in spot. Then make as much noise as you can from this end. Fletcher nodded bad. 10 minutes. After that, all bad breaks loose. Bear made his way through back doors and back ways of Cedar Ridge, moving with the quiet exact of a guy who'd spent decades hunting in mountain woods. Behind him, he could hear the town folks getting ready for their part in the plan, checking weapons, giving bullets, whispering last tells to each other. The barn was an old building that smelled of grass and horse sweat, but it gave perfect hide and a clear view of the bad guy's spot. Bear settled into the shadows near a broken window, his gun aimed on the flipped stagecoach where Eli Dalton was telling his men. Through his aim, Bear could see Dalton clear for the first time. The guy was maybe 40 with the thin, hard look of someone who'd lived by fight for most his grown life. But there was real sad in his face, too. The kind of hurt that came from losing someone you loved. Bear got the sad had carried it himself for 20 years. The diff was that Eli Dalton was letting his sad turn him into something bad, while Bear had learned to carry his quiet, using it to make himself stronger rather than more break. The sound of steady gun fire from the main street told Bear that Marshall Fletcher had started the trick. Dalton's men turned their notice east to the clear threat, just as planned. Bear settled his gun on his shoulder and aimed on Eli Dalton's chest. One shot would end this, take the gang's boss, and probably scatter the rest. It was the smart fight pick, the safe pick, the pick that would save most lives. But something held him back. Maybe it was the memory of Thomas Ashworth, who'd always believed in giving guys a chance topic a better path. Maybe it was Victoria's being in his life, reminding him that there were other to fight, even in bad spots. Or maybe it was just 20 years of alone teaching him that killing, even right killing, always left marks on the soul. Dalton, Bear called from the barn. This is Jacob McKenna. The bad leader turned fast, his gun swinging to Bear's spot. But Bear had on purpose put himself in deep shadow, seen enough to be heard, but not enough for clear aim. I'm the guy who killed your brother, Bear went on, and I'm giving you one chance to end this without more blood. You bad! Dalton yelled, shooting wild at the barn. His bullets broke wood, but found no body. Come out and face me like a guy. I'll come out, Bear said steady. But first, you need to get something about Samuel's death. He wasn't just taking those people. He was about to attack a 16-year-old girl. He gave him every chance to walk away. The gunfire from both spots had died as everyone tried to hear the talk between the two guys who'd brought this fight to Cedar Ridge. It was my little brother. Eli's voice broke with pain. I raised him after our parents died. He was all the family I'd left. I know what it's like to lose family, Bear said quiet. I know the kind of hole it tears in your soul, but your brother made his picks and they led him down a dark path. Don't let it make you follow him there. For a bit, Bear thought he might have got through to the guy. Eli Dalton lowered his gun a bit, his face twisted with inside fight. Then one of his men, a marked gun guy Bear didn't know, whispered something in Dalton's ear. The bad leader's look got hard again, and Bear knew the time for words had passed. You killed him, Dalton said, his voice cold as winter wind. And now you're gonna pay. Bear sighed and settled his gun more firm on his shoulder. Hetried to give the guy a pick just as he'd given Samuel Dalton a pick on that mountain path. Some people just couldn't take other to fight. The brass cabin paper in his shirt pocket, the law proof of his mountain home that Judge Morrison had put as proof of his good character, crinkled as he fixed his spot. That paper stood for 20 years of true work of building something big from nothing. It was proof that Jacob McKenna was more than just a killer, more than just a guy running from his past. But sometimes even true guys had to fight. Marshal Fletcher, Bear called. On my sign, give me cover fire to the stagecoach. Ready when you are, gave the answer. Bear took a deep breath and felt the known calm that had carried him through lots fights. Thomas's medal pressed on his chest. Victoria's ring on his finger, and the heavy of 20 years of picks, good and bad, sat on his shoulders. He'd spent 2 decades hiding from the world. Sure, his skill for fight made him not fit for nice society. But Victoria had shown him something diff. She'd seen past the mountain loner to the guy Thomas Ashworth had believed in. The soldier who'd risked his life to guard the good. Maybe it was time to stop running from what he was and start taking what he could become. Now! Bear yelled and stepped out of the shadows into the afternoon sun. The last face-off had started. Bear stepped into the dusty street with the sun at his back, throwing his shadow long across the blood-marked ground. The badge Marshal Fletcher had given him caught the light, a short deputy star that carried full, heavy-offed law. For the first time in 20 years, Jacob McKenna was wearing a sign of fair rather than running from it. Eli Dalton and his left men, maybe 6 now. The others, having run or fallen, turned their weapons to this lone guy walking steady down the middle of Main Street. The bad leader's face was twisted with sad and mad, his gun aimed on Bear's chest. You think that tin star makes you bulletproof? Dalton growled. I think it makes me in charge, Bear said back, never breaking step. In charge for ending this before more good people get hurt. Behind him. Bear could hear the town folks coming from their guard spots, following his lead despite the clear danger. Judge Morrison was there holding a big gun with set hands. Deputy Collins sighed him, young and scared, but not willing to let Bear face alone. Martha Morrison had armed with her late husband's hunt gun. Her face set with edge strong, but it was Victoria who got Bear's notice as she stepped beside him, her small gun steady in grip. The fancy Philadelphia rich had changed into something he'd never thought. A true Paul, someone willing to face danger at his side rather than wait safe in back. This is between me and McKenna, Dalton yelled, waving wild with his gun. The rest of you back off. It stopped being between just you and me when you brought a gang to scare this town, Bear said, his voice going clear across the sudden quiet street. Now it's between you and everyone who's tired of living in fear. Marshal Fletcher showed from behind the main store, his badge shining in the afternoon sun. Eli Dalton, by the power of Thiariagavi, I'm putting you and your men under lock for take, kill, and plan to do fight against Fed guys. Dalton laughed bitter. Arrest? You think I'm gonna let you put me in a cage after what this bad did to Samuel? Your brother was a killer and attacker, Victoria said cold, her schooled voice cutting through Dalton's big. Jacob saved good lives by stopping him. If you can't see the diff between fair and kill, then you're no better than Samuel was. The words hit Dalton like a hit. His face went white with mad, and Bear saw the time when sad finally pushed the guy past any hope of think. Kill them! Dalton yelled to his men. Kill them all! The street blew into fight. Bear dove right as Dalton's gun fired. The bullet passing close to his ear, he felt the heat. He rolled behind a horse holder and came up shooting. his first shot taking down the marked gun guy who'd whispered bad in Dalton's ear. Victoria had dropped to one knee beside a wood box, her small gun speaking twice fast. One of Dalton's men spun away with a yell of hurt, holding a broken shoulder. The woman, who'd never shot a gun in Mad before today, was proving to be a surprise good fighter. Marshal Fletcher and Deputy Collins were working as a team, their guns giving steady rule fire that kept the bad guys stuck behind their quick wall. Judge Morrison had set himself to cover the back way between buildings, stopping any side tries. But it was Martha Morrison who surprised all. The middle-aged woman had worked around to the north end of street, using her know of town's back paths to get behind the bad guy's spot. Her hunt gun cracked once, and another of Dalton's men dropped his weapon and stumbled into open hands up and give up. "Enough!" Eli Dalton yelled, coming from behind the flipped stage coach with wild eyes and smoking guns. "McKenna, face me, you scared." Bear looked at the guy across 30 yards of dusty ground and saw something that made his heart heavy. Eli Dalton was beyond think now, eaten by sad and mad, and the bad sure that dying hard was better than living with his hurt. Bear had been there himself in the dark months after war, when live blame had nearly made him eat his own gun. The only thing that had saved him was the big quiet of mountains, where a guy could find calm if he looked hard for it. Eli Dalton had never found that calm. "I'm right here," Bear said, stepping into open with his gun lowered. "But this doesn't have to end with more death." "Yes, it does," Dalton said back, lifting both his guns. "It ends with you joining my brother in bad place." The two guys faced each other in the usual pose of the edge, 40 yards apart, weapons ready, around by the left of fight and the watching eyes of a whole group. But this wasn't a cheap book face between good and bad. This was the hit of two guys shaped by loss, by fight, by the hard reel of a world that gave few second chances. One had found a way to carry his hurt without letting it bad all around him. The other had not. "I'm sorry about your brother," Bear said quiet. "I'm sorry about all." "Sorry don't bring back dead," Dalton said back, and drew his guns. Bear was faster. He'd always been faster. The loud of gunshots echoed off buildings lining Cedar Ridge's Main Street, followed by a quiet so full that even the wind seemed to hold breath. Eli Dalton lay still in the dust, his not-fired gun scattered by him, while Bear stood with smoking gun in hand, his face serious with the heavy of what he'd been forced to do. Victoria felt her heart stop as she watched Bear stagger a bit. One hand pressed to his left shoulder where dark blood was coming through his shirt. Dalton had got one shot before Bear's bullet hit. Not enough to kill, but enough to remind all that fight always took its price from both sides. Jacob. Victoria was at his side in a flash, her hands steady despite the shake in her voice. The small wedding ring he wore, her mom's ring, caught the light as he lowered his gun. "I'm okay," Bear said quiet, though his face was white with hurt and tired. "Just a scrape?" Martha Morrison showed with her doctor kit, the same she'd used to treat hurts in Cedar Ridge for the past 10 years. "Let me look at that shoulder," she said with Calm the left members of Dalton's gang, those who hadn't run or gave up, were being rounded by Marshal Fletcher and Deputy Collins. The fight was over, but the cost was written on every face in the street. Good guys had been hurt, stuff broken, and the calm of a group broken by the after of old fight. Judge Morrison came slow, his big gun still in hands, but pointed at ground. "Mr. McKenna, in light of today's evidence and the speak given during your trial, I'm official letting gold charges against you. You acted in guard of good life, both on the mountain path and here in Cedar Ridge." Bear nodded his thanks, but his notice was on Victoria as she helped Martha clean and wrap his shoulder hurt. The woman who'd walked into that courtroom 3 days ago saying to be his wife was now carrying his hurts with the soft skill of someone who'd made herself needed to his life. "The ring," Victoria said soft as Martha done her work. "It's yours now if you want." Bear looked down at the simple gold band on his finger, remembering the time she'd given it with words that had changed all between them. "Are you sure?" "This ain't just fight heat or fear of dying." Victoria's dark eyes met his with the same straight true that had first got his notice in that quick courtroom. "I've had 20 years to think this." "Jacob." 20 years to wonder what my life would have been if that letter got me. Now I know, and what do you know? That Thomas was right about us. That we do fit. She touched his face soft, her fingers following they lines carved by years of alone and hard. That I don't want to spend another 20 years wondering what might have been. Marshal Fletcher cut in before could answer. His look serious despite Wynn. McKenna, I've got an offer for you. The area gov needs guys like you, know, trust, willing to stand to the kind of bad that's been bugging these spots. You offering me a job, Marshal? I'm offering you a chance to make real change. Fed Deputy Marshal based here in Cedar Ridge if you want good pay, Fed power, and the back of Washington when you go against group crime. Bear thought the offer careful. 3 days ago, he'd been a loner facing a hanging. Sure, his skill for fight made him not fit for nice society. Now he was being offered a chance to use that same skill in help of fair and guard. What about my mountain cabin? He asked. Keep it, Fletcher said back. Use it as a getaway when you need a loan. But this area needs guys who get both worlds, the wild and nice. You've shown you can bridge that gap. Victoria squeezed Bear's not-hurt hand. It's your pick, Jacob. But you should know that I've made mine, which is I'm staying in Cedar Ridge. I've already talked with Judge Morrison about buying land here. Maybe starting a business that could help this group grow. The Edge needs people willing to build something lasting, not just take wealth and leave. Bear stared at her in wonder. You'd give up Philadelphia. Your family's business, your social spot, all you've built there. I've already given it up, Victoria said simple. Sold the business, fixed my stuff, said byes. I came west looking for you, but I found something more. A place where I can be useful. Where I can make picks based on what I believe rather than what people expect. The means of her words sat over Bear like sun rise over mountaintops. She wasn't just offering to marry him. She was offering to build a life together, to make something neither could do alone. The badge, Bear said to Marshal Fletcher. Does it come with the power to do marriages? Fletcher grinned. As fact it does. Fed marshals can lead weddings when no other fit guys are around. Judge Morrison stepped forward with a smile. Though if you'd like a normal ceremony, I'd be honored to do the service. Bear looked around at the faces around them, Martha Morrison smiling with mom pride. Deputy Collins grinning despite tired. Town folks who'd risked lives to guard a guy they barely knew. These weren't just watchers to a wedding ask. They were the base of a group he was being asked to join. Victoria Ashworth, Bear said formal, taking her mom's ring from his little finger and holding it to her. Will you marry me? Not because your brother asked me to. Not because we've been through danger together. But because I love you and want to spend my left years making you happy. Victoria's smile was bright as she held her left hand. Jacob McKenna, I thought you'd never ask, right? The ring slid on her finger as if made for her, catching the afternoon light with same shine as the joy tears on her cheeks. Around them, the people of Cedar Ridge started to cheer, their voices rising above the dusty street where fight had so recent held way. When? Victoria asked. Right now, Bear said back, surprising himself with the sure in his voice. We've waited 20 years already. I don't want to wait another day. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. Well then, if Marshal Fletcher will be watcher, and Martha Morrison will stand for the bride, I guess we can have a wedding right here in the street. As the quick ceremony started, Bear felt something he'd thought lost forever, the sense of belonging to something bigger than himself. The badge on his chest stood not just power, but duty. The ring on Victoria's finger meant not just love, but team. And the faces around them promised not just take, but real group. Thomas Ashworth's sea, made in the needy clear of a fight field 20 years ago, was finally happening. Two alone people had found each other at last, and in doing so, found they were no longer alone in the world. 6 months later, the morning sun painted Cedar Ridge's main street gold. As Victoria McKenna stepped on the porch of the town's newest business, Ashworth and McKenna General Stuff and Ship, the bullet holes from that fight October day had been fixed, and the fresh paint on the front spoke of a group set to growth rather than just living. The new marriage paper, real this time, hung framed on the wall inside next to Thomas Ashworth's Army medal and a picture of the couple taken on their wedding day. But the most dear paper was one that few ever saw. Jacob's first ask letter from 1862, careful kept between glass and kept in their private office as a reminder of how patient love could beat even the longest of parts. Victoria smoothed her useful cotton dress, afar from the silk gown she'd once liked, and walked across the street to the law office where her husband was getting ready for his morning checks. Fed Deputy Marshal Jacob. McKenna had proven surprise good at bringing law and order to the area. His name for fair matched only by his no to take those who hit on the good. "Morning, Mrs. McKenna," Deputy Collins called from his desk. The young guy had grown into his jobs over the past months, his start nervous, replaced by quiet good. "Marshall's checking the night reports from Silverton." Victoria found Bear. She still thought him by that name, though the area knew him as Marshall McKenna, looking over wires and wrote reports from other spots. The badge sat easy on his chest now, no longer the strange sign it had seemed that first day. "Anything bad?" Victoria asked, sitting in the chair by his desk that everyone in town had learned to think as hers. "The Carmichael gang hit another supply cart near Durango," Bear said back, his look worried. "Third one this month. They're getting braver." Victoria looked at the map on wall where color pins marked recent bad stuff. Her head for business had proven key in tracking ways and guessing where trouble might hit next. "They're moving north, following the mine paths. At this rate, they'll reach Cedar Ridge in the month." "That's what I'm thinking, too." Bear leaned back in his chair without touching the mark on his left shoulder. A forever remind of the day their life together had really started. "Might need to take a group out there. See if we can stop them before they get this far." "How long would you be gone?" "Week, maybe 2. Depends on how well they hide tracks." Bear reached to take her hand, their wedding rings catching the morning light through the office window. "I know it's not easy, me away so much." Victoria squeezed his hand soft. "Jacob, I married a guy who'd spent 20 years alone in mountains. Did you think I'd expect you to become a store guy overnight? Some women might. Some women didn't wait 20 years to find the right guy." Victoria stood and went to the window, looking at the busy street. "Besides, someone needs to keep peace out there. Better. It should be someone who gets thetiff between fair and payback." That afternoon, they rode to their mountain cabin together, a trip they made when Bear's jobs let. The little home had become their safe, a place where the Fed Marshal could set aside his badge and become just a guy who loved his wife and the wild that had shaped him. The cabin was much as Bear had left it 6 months ago, though Victoria's touches were everywhere. Curtains in windows, books on shelves, a garden spot where she'd planted veggies and flowers. She'd taken to mountain life with surprise, like learning to hunt and fish and read weather signs with the same set she'd once used to business books. "I've been thinking," Victoria said as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the tops purple and gold, "about what we want our left mark to be." Bear looked at her curious. "Left mark? Thomas and I used to talk about it when kids. What sign we'd leave on world, how people would remember us." Victoria was quiet for a bit, her eyes far with memory. "He thought he'd be remembered for his brave in war. Instead, he's remembered for bringing 2 alone people together. Is that enough for him?" "I think it would be more than enough." Victoria leaned on Bear's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his breath. "For us, I think our left mark will be what we build. This group, the peace we help keep, the example we set for what's possible when good people no give up on each other." Bear nodded slow. The guy who'd once thought his skill for fight made him not fit for nice society had learned something key over past months. Fight was just a tool, no more bad in itself than a hammer or plow. What mattered was how used and by who and for what goal. Martha Morrison told me something fun today. Victoria said 3 more families moving to Cedar Ridge next month, including a doctor and school teacher. Word spreading that this is a safe place to build life. "And what do you think about that?" "I think Thomas would be proud," Victoria said back simple. He always believed that one axe could change world one person at a time. We're proof he was right. As full dark sat over mountains, they went inside to warm of cabin. Victoria pulled her skin book, the same she'd wrote in for 15 years, and opened a fresh page. "Dear Thomas, it's been 6 months since Jacob and I married, and I wanted you to know that your trust in both us was right. The guy you picked for me has become all you said he would be, strong when needed, gentle when better, and wise to no diff. We're building something here, Thomas. Not just marriage, but group, place where people can find second chances that this hard country so rarely gives. Jacob become the kind law guy you would proud serve under, and I've found I'm much happier building new than ever managing got. I think about you every day, but sad doesn't eat me anymore. Instead, reminds me be thankful for what I have, cherish time given, never take for granted love of good guy. Your sister and Jacob's wife, Victoria McKenna." She closed book. Bear came from bedroom with something in hands, small wood carve of 2 figures standing together. Their faces turned to far sea. "Wedding gift?" Victoria asked, liking the make. More like a promise, Bear said back, setting carve on fire shelf where caught firelight. I carved it during my first week as marshal, when I got I never gonna be that alone mountain guy again. Victoria looked at little shape, man and woman, hands joined, facing what came next together. It was rough compared to pro art, but caught something key about their team. Their shared set to building lasting from raw stuff of hope and set. It's perfect, she said, and meant it. Outside cabin, Colorado wind sang through pines with voice of friendless chants. The area still wild, still danger, still full of guys like Dalton gang who picked fight over good, but also full of people like citizens of Cedar Ridge who'd learned sometimes good folks make stand and win. In morning, Marshal Jacob McKenna pin on badge and ride out face whatever threats came from Vast Edge. Victoria McKenna returned to town, manage business, and help newcomers find place in growing group. They face challenges separate, but carry strength of team with wherever went. Forged marriage paper that brought together long replaced by real law bonds, but real paper of union something deeper. Shared get that some promises worth keeping, even when take 20 years fulfill, and some love strong enough bridge any gap, whether miles or years or terrible distances between alone hearts. Thomas Ashworth see vindicated last. Two people who might never found each other discovered stronger together than either ever been alone. In harsh land often rewarded self and mean, they chosen build something based kindness, fair, radical notion everyone deserved chance at getting better. Legacy worth living for, if need worth dying for. But more key legacy worth building day by day, pick by pick, in endless work turning wild into